What if the entire destiny of a nation was decided in just 3 brutal, sun-scorched summer days? In July of 1863, the United States was on a knife's edge. The Confederate Army, which seemed invincible after a string of stunning victories, had brought the war north for the first time on a massive scale. Their commander, Robert E. Lee, was confident. His Army of Northern Virginia was in high spirits, and they intended to deal a crushing blow on enemy soil that might just force Washington to sue for peace. The clash came at a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, a place of just 2,400 people and a hub for a dozen converging roads. It would become the costliest single battle in American history. But it was so much more than a battle. It was a crucible that would burn away one version of America and forge another in the fire. Over 3 days, more than 50,000 men would become casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. How did these 3 days of chaos, courage, and catastrophic failure not only decide the outcome of the Civil War, but permanently change the meaning of freedom, the power of the government, and the very soul of the nation? The road to Gettysburg really began with Confederate confidence. After his masterful victory at Chancellorsville in May 1863, Robert E. Lee felt his army was unstoppable. His plan was audacious. Invaded Pennsylvania, take the war out of ravaged Virginia, supply his army from the rich northern countryside, and threaten major cities like Philadelphia. Lee hoped a huge victory in the North would shatter Union morale and empower the growing anti-war movement, forcing President Lincoln to the negotiating table. For weeks, Lee's army moved north, a gray tide sweeping through the Shenandoah Valley. But crucially, Lee had lost his eyes and ears. His flamboyant cavalry chief, J.B., was off on a controversial ride around the Union Army, leaving Lee effectively blind to where the enemy was. Meanwhile, the Union's Army of the Potomac was chasing him down, but its leadership was in chaos. Just 3 days before the battle, a frustrated Lincoln replaced General Joseph Hooker with a steady, if somewhat quiet, General George Gordon Meade. Meade now had the massive task of finding and stopping Lee's invasion. The battle itself started almost by accident. On June 30th, a Confederate brigade marched toward Gettysburg, supposedly looking for shoes. They spotted Union cavalry and pulled back. The next morning, July 1st, their division commander, General Henry Hett, pushed forward again, convinced he was only up against local militia. He was wrong. He ran smacked into the dismounted Union cavalry of Brigadier General John Buford. Buford was a sharp, tough commander who instantly understood the high ground south of Gettysburg, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, and Cemetery Ridge was the key to the whole fight. His mission was simple: hold up, buy time for the Union infantry to get there and dig in on that critical ground. His troopers, armed with rapid-firing carbines, put up a ferocious defense, delaying a much larger Confederate force for precious hours. Around 10:30 a.m., the 1st Union Infantry arrived, led by the highly respected Major General John F. Reynolds. As he directed his men into the fight, Reynolds was struck and killed, becoming the highest-ranking officer to die at Gettysburg. Despite the loss, his men, including the famed Iron Brigade, fought like hell. But the Confederates just kept coming. More of Lee's army slammed into the Union lines from the north and west. By the afternoon, the outnumbered Union forces were over. Their lines collapsed, and they were forced into a desperate retreat through the streets of Gettysburg, finally taking refuge on the very high ground Buford had picked out, Cemetery Hill. The first day was a clear Confederate victory, but it ended with a massive, squandered opportunity. As the broken Union soldiers scrambled to fortify Cemetery Hill, Lee sent a message to his subordinate, General Richard Ewell. He was to take the hill if Ewell, who was new to his command and used to more direct orders from his legendary predecessor, Stonewall Jackson, hesitated. He decided it wasn't practicable. That hesitation would become one of the most critical turning points of the war. The Union Army was allowed to dig in, fortify the high ground, and create a nearly unbreakable defensive position. And this is where you see that the battle wasn't just about men fighting men, it was about men fighting for position. The Union line, once it was fully formed, looked like a giant fishhook. It started at Culp's Hill, curved around Cemetery Hill, and ran south along Cemetery Ridge for 2 miles, ending at 2 hills called Little Round Top and Big Round Top. This high ground gave the Union a tremendous defensive advantage. Their cannons could dominate the open fields below, and because they had interior lines, they could rush troops from one spot to another far faster than the Confederates could on their longer, exterior lines. Meade's army had lost the day's fight, but they had won the race to the best defensive terrain on the map. That ground would become the stage for the next 2 days of unimaginable carnage, and it forced Lee to do something he hated: attack a well-defended army in a strong position. On the morning of July 2nd, both armies were dug in. The Union fishhook was bristling with nearly 90,000 men. Lee, with about 70,000, was determined to attack. His plan was to smash both Union flanks at once. General James Longstreet, his most trusted commander, would hit the Union left and try to roll up their line. At the same time, Ewell would attack the Union right at Culp's Hill, hoping to split Meade's army in two. Longstreet, however, hated the plan. He argued they should swing around the Union army, find better ground, and force Meade to attack them. But Lee was determined. The attack went forward, but it was delayed for hours, giving the Union even more time to prepare. When the assault finally kicked off in the late afternoon, it unleashed some of the most savage fighting of the war. Places that were once just local landmarks became forever synonymous with American sacrifice. The wheat, the peach orchard, Devil's Den. These spots changed hands again and again in a brutal whirlwind of bayonets and bullets. But the most critical fight of the day and maybe of the entire war happened on the far left flank of the Union line, at a rocky, wooded hill called Little Round Top. Because of a series of command blunders, the hill had been left completely undefended. Meade's chief engineer, General Governor K. Warren, spotted the mistake just in the nick of time and frantically sent the nearest Union troops racing to the summit. That unit was the 20th Maine, commanded by a 34-year-old college professor named Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Chamberlain and his 386 men had barely gotten into position when Confederate regiments from Alabama came storming up the hill. For over an hour, the 20th Maine threw back wave after wave of attacks. They were running out of bullets, and men were falling left and right. Chamberlain knew if his line broke, the entire Union army could collapse. In a moment of sheer desperation, he made a decision that would become the stuff of legend. With his men exhausted and their ammo almost gone, he yelled the order. The downhill swinging door charge was so shocking and ferocious that it shattered the attacking Confederates. The 20th Maine had saved Little Round Top, and this is where you see a new idea of American courage being forged. These weren't professional soldiers, they were citizens, teachers, farmers, and laborers answering an unbelievable challenge. The Civil War was fought by volunteers, and Gettysburg was their ultimate test. It created a new national story of heroism, one based not on who your father was, but on the grit and sacrifice of ordinary people fighting for a cause. Chamberlain's brilliant, gutsy leadership became a powerful symbol of this new American ideal. As darkness fell, the fighting died down. The Union had bent everywhere but had broken nowhere. Their lines had held, but at a terrible cost. The casualties for this single day were over 20,000 combined, making it bloodier than many entire battles of the war. Lee's plan for July 3rd came from his belief that he had been agonizingly close to victory. He figured Meade must have weakened his center to protect the flanks, so he decided to aim a massive punch directly at the heart of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. It was a huge gamble. Longstreet was again completely against it, arguing that number 15,000 men could possibly take that position. But Lee would not be moved. The day began with a deafening artillery duel. For nearly 2 hours, over 150 Confederate cannons hammered the Union center in what was probably the loudest man-made sound in the history of the Western Hemisphere up to that point. The Union guns answered. Then, around 3 p.m., the Confederate cannons went quiet. Out of the woods on Cemetery Ridge, a line of soldiers emerged. It stretched for a mile. Nearly 12,500 Confederates, led by the division of General George Pickett, began a deliberate, almost stately march across a mile of open ground, straight into the mouth of the Union defense. This was at the high water mark of the Confederacy. The Union artillery, which had saved its ammunition, opened up with horrifying effect, tearing huge gaps in the advancing lines. As they got closer, rifle fire ripped through their ranks. But still, they came on. A small band of Confederates, led by General Lewis Armistead, actually made it over the stone wall at the Union line, but there were too few of them. The Union defenders swarmed him. Armistead was killed, and the men who followed him were shot, captured, or driven back. The Great Charge was a disaster. In less than an hour, Pickett's division lost over 60% of its men. As the shattered survivors streamed back to their lines, Lee rode out to meet them, saying over and over, "It is all my fault." The Battle of Gettysburg was over. The next day, July 4th, as the Union celebrated its Independence Day and got news of another huge victory at Vicksburg, Lee began his sad, painful retreat back to Virginia. When the smoke cleared, it revealed a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The fields were littered with the dead and dying. Combined casualties for the 3 days topped 51,000, making it the costliest single battle in U.S. history. Nearly a third of Lee's veteran army was gone. He would never again be able to launch a major invasion of the North. This was the turning point. Militarily, Gettysburg shattered the aura of invincibility around Robert E. Lee. The Confederacy couldn't replace the experienced men and officers it lost there. From this point on, the war in the East would be a slow, grinding war of attrition that the South simply could not win. Psychologically, the victory sent a jolt of energy through the North, boosting morale and strengthening President Lincoln's political position when he needed it most. But the most profound change forged at Gettysburg came 4.5 months later, not from a general, but from the president. On November 19, 1863, Abraham Lincoln went to the battlefield to dedicate a new national cemetery. The main speaker, a famous orator named Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln then stood up and delivered a speech that lasted barely 2 minutes and had just 271 words. It would become one of the most important speeches in human history. With those few words, Lincoln did something extraordinary. He redefined the entire purpose of the war, and with it, the purpose of America. He didn't start by talking about the Constitution. He reached back further, to 1776. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In that one sentence, he tied the brutal sacrifice at Gettysburg directly to the nation's founding ideal. He argued the war was now a test of whether a nation built on such a radical idea could even survive. He called on the living to make sure the dead shall not have died in vain, by dedicating themselves to a new birth of freedom. This was revolutionary. Before this, the North's stated war aim was mainly about preserving the Union. But Lincoln, with the Emancipation Proclamation and now the Gettysburg Address, explicitly bound the cause of union to the cause of human freedom and equality. The war was no longer just about holding the country together. It was about creating a better, more just one. He laid the moral groundwork for the 13th Amendment, which would finally abolish slavery. The impact was immense, but also complicated. For African Americans, the victory in Lincoln's words were a powerful symbol of hope, but the reality on the ground was still dangerous. During the invasion, Confederate troops had captured free black residents of Pennsylvania and sent them south into slavery, a brutal reminder of the stakes. Even after the battle, black veterans who fought for the Union were initially denied burial in the national cemetery they helped create, a stark sign that the new birth of freedom would be a long, hard struggle. So, how did 3 days in a Pennsylvania town change America forever? Militarily, Gettysburg broke the back of the Confederate war machine in the East. It was the turning point from which the South could never recover, setting the stage for the Union's final victory. Politically, it gave Abraham Lincoln the platform to redefine the nation's purpose. The Gettysburg Address transformed the conflict from a war to save a country into a war to define its soul, establishing equality as the central promise of American democracy. It gave us a vision of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that still inspires movements for liberty around the world. And finally, it seared itself into the American identity. Gettysburg became hallowed ground, a permanent symbol of sacrifice and reunion. It created a new kind of American hero, the citizen soldier, and gave voice, through Lincoln, to a more perfect Union. The America that existed before July 1863, a nation fractured and unsure if its own founding ideals were even possible, died on those fields. The one that emerged, though scarred and still deeply flawed, was now set on a new path, committed to a future where the promise of liberty might one day apply to all. That is the enduring legacy of Gettysburg. The battle is over, but the fight to live up to the ideals it defined continues to this day. If you want to explore more of the pivotal moments that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. We break down the history you need to know.